Okay, welcome to lecture number 2 for History 497, the Salem Witch Trials, titled Puritan New England, 1620 to 1619. And we have an awful lot of ground to cover here to summarize the entirety of Puritan New England society leading up to the Salem Witch Trials. So this one might be a little bit longer than the first lecture, but we're ready to get a little bit more into the good stuff as far as understanding something about Puritans and Puritanism as it was practiced in New England, because it becomes very, somewhat different, and then later very different from what was being practiced in England. So with that in mind, let's have a little bit of a review and make sure we understand Puritanism in England. And as I mentioned in the last lecture, there are two varieties, essentially, of what was known as Puritanism in England. And that is the mainstream. They are the majority. They are the ones who are at least nominally still within the Church of England and are committed to trying to reform the Church of England to a Calvinist theology and independent practice. And these are the people who are eventually going to establish the colony of Massachusetts Bay in 1630. The other group, the smaller faction, are the separatists, the followers of Robert Brown. They, of course, abjure the Church of England entirely, and they are the ones who are going to eventually establish the Plymouth colony 10 years earlier in 1620. So, again, by way of a certain degree of review, looking at Puritans, during the reigns of Mary Tudor, Edward, then Elizabeth. They are pushing for what they consider to be the completion of the English Reformation. Queen Mary I, of course, a devout Catholic, trying to exterminate Protestantism. But fortunately for them, her reign was short. Edward VI was a committed Protestant and gave the Puritans a little bit of something of what they wanted, but nowhere near the full gamut of what they would like to have seen. And the church that Queen Elizabeth I inherits is one that is firmly Anglican. A lot of the superficial aspects of Catholicism have left the church. For instance, and most importantly, the idea of purgatory is, of course, absolutely gone. I had mentioned before that King Henry VIII's Church of England was essentially Catholic in all of its important respects. But by the time of Edward's and then Elizabeth's reign, we have something that is much closer to what Luther and Calvin at least would say, well, is certainly a few steps forward away from what they consider to be Catholic superstition, Caesaropapacy, things like that. But of course, there are radical Puritans and radical Protestants who are still very unhappy about this. And under Mary's reign, of course, a lot of them had fled to various parts of continental Europe, some of them gathering in Switzerland and Geneva to learn at the feet of John Calvin. When Elizabeth ascends the throne, many of these Puritans return and continue to press for her to complete their vision of religious reform, which she strongly resists. Now, some of this, many, I should say, of the separatists who have given up on the Church of England, of course, have left and refused to come back and end up settling in Holland, in the much more religiously pluralistic and liberal atmosphere that Holland was. When King James I comes to the throne in 1630, although he is a Scottish Presbyterian, he is a Calvinist essentially in his theology, but he does not agree with the way the Puritans want to organize the churches ecclesiologically, and that is to mean the degree to which they want the churches to be independent of any kind of overarching authority or control, be it religious in the form of the Archbishop of Canterbury any more than it was in terms of governmental authority. The Puritan churches were understood to each be independent of each other. And then this is what will eventually in New England be referred to as congregationalism. That is to say that the congregation, along with the ministry, decide what each church is going to do in terms of the way they interpret Calvinist theology and then the way that they actually practice in terms of their daily worship. So that is known as independency. So you have a great many Puritans in England who are technically and nominally part of the Church of England, but are functionally not part of the Church of England. Whereas you've got some separatists in England who are, see themselves as suffering and living in a place that is soon to experience God's damnation. But then you have the separatists who are living in Holland, and things are all right for the most part. But by the time those people start having children and those children start growing up, one of the things that these English immigrants become increasingly worried about is the degree to which their children are growing up, developing Dutch attitudes towards life, the universe, and everything. In fact, because frankly, they are living in a foreign country, and the influences of the language and the culture are going to be significant. And what happens is that these English separatists want to live as an absolutely hermetically sealed enclave, immune to any of those influences, and that's just simply not possible. And so they start to get more and more worried about the fact that their children are growing up essentially half Dutch, half English. The rigidity of their religion being what it is, they're not happy about liberal Dutch attitudes creeping into their children's minds. So this is what's going to spur the push to find somewhere else where they can go. And one of those options is obviously the Americas, because in the 1610s, as you may know, we have the Virginia colony established, and although it had a difficult first 10 years or so, by 1618, 1619, things have stabilized substantially. And so what happens is that you've got separatist Puritans who start to work toward establishing a joint stock company and seek a charter from the king in order to establish a colony near Virginia. And this is where William Brewster and William Bradford come in 1619, and they prevail upon Virginia Company shareholders and leadership, and they get a grant of land that was technically belonging to the Virginia Company. It's on the border in, I believe, what would be present-day Maryland at this point. And they were going to establish a colony of their own. This is where in July 1620, the first contingent of settlers board the Mayflower and take off for Virginia. But as you may know, the journey was particularly arduous. The North Atlantic seas were particularly rough and stormy. The ship mast broke at one point and had to be repaired. They almost turned around and went back home, but they stuck it out. But then the going was slow. They started running out of fresh water and edible food. And so they stopped at Cape Cod, that being this little sort of come here finger of land off the northeastern coast to rest, repair the ship, try to get some resupply, and then continue on to their grant of land next to Virginia. But what happens is that the bulk of the passengers, most of whom in fact are not separatist pilgrims, or I should say separatist Puritans. They called themselves pilgrims. That's how they've come down to us in sort of the mythology of New England. But one of the things that the Plymouth Company was very smart about was that they knew, learning from Virginia's mistakes, that when you start a colony, you need all sorts of people. You need agriculturalists, you need carpenters, you need craftsmen, you need military, experienced military, you need ordinary laborers, you need all kinds of people. And so most of the people who go are not, in fact, Puritans at all, and they form the bulk of, along with some of the separatists. They don't want to go any further. They want to stay here on Cape Cod because they're afraid that if they just try to continue the journey any further, they may all die. So they decide to stay on Cape Cod, established Plymouth here in southern Massachusetts, what is now southern Massachusetts, and this is where they draw up the Mayflower Compact. Now, I think it's important for us to understand not just the physical landscape that these New Englanders are settling in, but also the human landscape, because it's too easy to fall into the trap of sort of forgetting that this land was not empty of human habitation. Now, to be fair, because of earlier colonial contacts and exploratory contacts going back to the late 16th century, European diseases unwittingly brought by these explorers and early colonists have begun to rage through North America and begins to wipe out large percentages of native populations. And the very fact of the matter is that a lot of English colonialism here on the Atlantic seaboard would not have been possible were it not for the depopulations caused by these disease epidemics. But these native peoples are, of course, still around. Of course, there are still substantial numbers of these people, and I think it's important for us to kind of know this landscape a little bit, because you will hear a good bit about them as you do your reading for this course. I'm going to talk about a little bit of it here in this lecture, so it's a good idea to kind of have this landscape and this geography in mind. So starting here up in the far north in what is in Maine, we have the Abenaki, or an alternative spelling is pronounced Wabanaki, same thing. We have the Penobscots and the Penacooks, and then down into Massachusetts proper, you have the Massachusetts Indians, the Nipmucs, the Wampanoag, Narragansett, and then heading westward into what is now Connecticut, you have the Pequots, the Mohegans, and the Mohicans. And then over here, you have the Iroquoian peoples. Okay, and so up here in New France, you have the Huron, but then here is a grouping of tribes, the Mohawks, the Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas, who have grouped together into the Iroquois League of Peace. These were historically warring tribes, rivals who have banded together for mutual security and mutual prosperity. And these guys are absolutely the most powerful Indian group anywhere in this region. They have largely destroyed much of Huron power in far northern upstate New York, present-day New York, and confined them to present-day Canada. They've also done much the same with the Shawnee down in towards present-day Ohio. The Mohegans, Pequots, these guys have to submit themselves to the Iroquois, whenever the need arises. But we're not going to have much concern with the Iroquois in this story. But it's useful to remind ourselves that they are out there and they are highly influential. But we're mostly going to be concerned with these groups here, and it's helpful to kind of just, again, to have that geography in mind. So, okay. The separatists established themselves at Cape Cod and are befriended by the Wampanoag people under the leadership of Massasoit, who frankly takes pity on the strangers, because if, like I said, they had an extremely difficult journey. They were half starved, dehydrated. Many of them were ill, and frankly, he did not see them as any particular threat, and he figured that they would live under his protection and under his overall leadership. You had a similar kind of thing happen earlier with the chief of the Powhatans and the English in Virginia, and that was a source of some conflict, and so is this going to be a source of some conflict. Okay. So, yes, there are some difficulties at the beginning of the Plymouth venture, but because of the better mix of kinds of people with different skill sets, and the fact that there's a more balanced sex ratio, there's a greater ability for these people to reproduce themselves, that those early struggles don't last very long. And so by 1625, 1626, things are moving along more or less smoothly. And it's during this time that we have coming to the throne. Once James I dies, you have King Charles the First, and this is part of that Stuart line connecting Scotland and England. Charles I is very as close to Catholic as an Anglican can be, and in fact, he has more trouble accepting the prejudice against Catholics than he does with regard to his own feelings about the Puritans. He hates the Puritans and wants to put an end to their movement to as far as can reasonably and politically be accomplished. And so he steps up in tolerance against Puritans while drawing down official intolerance for Catholicism. Okay. In fact, he befriends a number of noble families who have Catholic ties or who are secretly Catholic themselves. And this stepping up of intolerance and restrictions on the Puritans is going to lead many of them to start to think maybe England is maybe the only way England can be reformed is to do it from the outside, not necessarily as a separatist, but this is where John Winthrop comes in. He's a lawyer, he's a Puritan, and he says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to establish a colony in America. We're going to do it in Massachusetts, okay? And the idea is, as he says, we're going to build a city on a hill. He believes that what will happen is that they will establish a colony built on Puritan religious and social and political ideas that will be so successful, so smooth, become such a, what he called a holy commonwealth, that it will serve as a model, not just for future colonies in America, but actually for the complete reform and reorganization of England itself. And this is why when he gave a sort of a sermon on the Arbella, the lead ship bringing 700 people to Massachusetts, he says, the eyes of all the world are upon us, because he believes that this is the way it will happen. They will establish such a wonderful, commonwealth, that then England will realize the error and then literally beg the Puritans to come back and work their magic in England. That's the idea. And that's where we get this notion of the city on a hill. Now, let's talk about these Puritans a little bit. And here is a somewhat comic misrepresentation of what we think of when we think of the Puritans, and that is of a dour, joyless people, always wearing black. And as one critic accused them, one English critic accused Puritans of being people who spend their time, quote, smoking out their lives in corners, unquote, brooding over sin, constantly worrying about their worthiness for salvation and things like that, and that they were, classic killjoys. And also that they were fundamentally and highly superstitious. The Salem Witch Trials is to a high degree responsible for this misrepresentation of who the Puritans were. First and foremost, it's very important for us to understand, of all of the religious groups living in England at that time, the Puritans were among the most rational and scientific of any group you're going to find. This is the time of the scientific revolution, you may recall. This is the time of Sir Isaac Newton. This is the time of the discoveries in science that's going to demolish once and for all the geocentric universe. And we're going to start discovering laws of gravitation. We're going to start discovering a lot of laws of nature. And the Puritans were right there pointing out that all of these new scientific discoveries are proof of God's existence. They are not challenges to God's existence. They are not challenges to revelation. They are, in fact, supports for revelation. They were especially fond of the logical writings of a guy named Petrus Ramus, and they employed logical arguments to prove that their Calvinist theology is the only correct theology that there can be. But they also embraced scientific discoveries as just adding to proof that the universe, running on according to Newtonian laws of physics, proves the existence of God. They are often, Puritans are often thought of as a joyless people. Far from it. Their belief was that God created a world that absolutely tests faith, but also rewards faith. And what are the rewards of faith? It's not necessarily just grace and election. It also translates as happiness, joy, love. Okay? And so the world obviously is full of temptations. Well, what tempts us? Well, of course, pleasure, right? Things that we want to do. We like to eat a good meal. We love to enjoy beauty. We love to do things that make us feel good. And Puritans said that it is absolutely all right to feel good. God created a world that has terrible aspects of it, but there are more things to the world that are delightful and enjoyable, and it is perfectly all right to indulge in those things, but only through the lens of faith and gratitude. And so go have a pint at the pub, make love to your wife or your husband, but don't give yourself over to those pleasures inordinately. Pleasures are there. Pleasures are should be enjoyed, but very much within moderation. This is one of the probably the most infamous prejudice against Puritans. This idea is that they were extremely sexually repressed people. They most certainly were not. But let's be clear. They believed that sex feels good for a reason. God made it so that we will want to do it, so that there will be more people, right? So that we'll have children. So of course, sex feels good. And it's okay for sex to feel good, but only if you're doing it to have kids, right? And only between within a marriage. Okay, so yes, premarital sex is absolutely a no-no. Masturbation's a no-no. But within a marriage, you know, what you do in your bedroom, there are some things that they don't want you doing and don't think are a good idea, because it's all about producing children. So certain things that you might do in the bedroom that have nothing to do with impregnating somebody are considered perversions that you are not allowed to do. But no, they said sex is fine as long as it's within marriage, and it's okay to enjoy it. You see here this picture of Ned Flanders. Again, they're all dressed in black. No. Yes, black was a popular color for men to wear because it's sort of the same as, even today, men wear black suits, very frequently. Black's a good color, right? Black's a classic color, but it's not universal. And Puritans wore all kinds of different colors, but they did have problems with excess of apparel. They did have problems with elaborate dress, elaborate hairstyles, and rich fabrics and lots of decoration and jewelry. They did not like any of that. They believed that those things were indulging vanity, and it's okay to look good. And they made the argument that simple looks better. So yes, they dressed simply, but not from a point of view of saying, that everybody should be boring. And no, they just believed it was part of Christian modesty. But, everyone knows that they're famous for those hats. Those hats are not unique to Puritans. Lots of men wore these hats all over England. But it does form the logo of the Massachusetts Turnpike, which I think is pretty funny. But okay, here's a portrait of Massachusetts Bay's first governor, John Winthrop, and okay, so there it is. There's the black suit, right? And the sort of austere looking expression. But that was true for everybody. When you were having your portrait painted, you did not portray yourself smiling and showing teeth or anything like that. You always wanted to depict yourself as sort of a sober, serious minded person, and certainly Winthrop was that. But again, they stressed simplicity and a certain degree of austerity. And they exhibited this in not just in the clothes they wore, but in the way they built their physical landscape. So here is a reconstruction of a typical early New England meeting house. They didn't call their houses of worship churches. They talked about it as the house of God and all of that, but they also referred to worship services as meetings. So where do you go for that? You go to the meeting house. Now, many of the meeting houses in England, are varying degrees of simple to more elaborate. But but in New England, of course, there's a shortage of building materials, and this they use to an advantage to underscore, I guess, the point that things should always be, lean toward the simple and the austere. So when you look at this, and it's not a total reconstruction. It's a partial reconstruction. Some of the building was still intact. This is on the Rebecca Nurse farmstead in Danvers, Massachusetts. And Rebecca Nurse is a name that you'll hear again. And this was restored many years ago. And to look at it, it looks like a regular house. You have a single door here to go in. And you'll notice that there's not many windows because glass was very difficult to come by, very expensive, and so the windows are few and fairly small. But that's also in keeping with trying to minimize excessive decoration. And you look at the inside, and you'll notice it's very bare bones. Here is the altar. This is basically the area, the preserve of the what they call the divine or the minister, who would take a few steps up to stand in this pulpit and deliver his sermon to people sitting on simple benches. You might have a few dignitaries like deacons or whatever sitting in chairs nearby or whatever, but most of the people would be sitting out in front, sitting on the benches. Depending on where they are, they may or may not be separated sexually in terms of gender. Men on one side, women on the other side. More often than not, it was seated by families, and the more prominent families would sit up front, and the poorer families would be seated toward the back. So, let's talk about Puritan New England theology and church practice. And one of the things that English Puritans were concerned about was about Calvinist beliefs about election. As you may recall, Calvin believed that original sin alone was enough to condemn the entire human race to hell. And so he believed that because the vast majority of people who consider themselves Christians behave in a Christian fashion, not because it's the right thing to do, but only because they're trying to avoid eternal damnation and are yearning for the physical and emotional and mental delights of heaven. Therefore, a very, very small number of the totality of the human race are going to heaven. Which begs a few questions, right? Well, how am I to know if I'm saved, right? How is a minister, for instance, to know if someone in their congregation is among the elect? And one of the things that English Puritans talked about was there must be something that they called visible sainthood, right? And that the ideal church, the perfect church, should be composed entirely of visible saints. Well, what does that mean? Well, it starts with these two concepts. The first is justification. And this is the imputation of Christ's righteousness to sinners, achieved only through faith. And as I said, if you're a Calvinist, remember, no effort on your part can be expended on this. The degrees to which that you pray, read your Bible, attend church, perform charitable works, indeed perform good works, are simply a reflection of your conviction that these things are to be done not because they earn you points toward salvation. You are absolutely helpless. You cannot do anything to affect your salvation. They said that, Calvin said that's like people thinking that you can bribe God into letting you into his exclusive club, right? So just as original sin is imputed to all humanity, Christ's righteousness is imputed to sinners achieved only through faith. But if you are justified, that leads to sanctification, okay? And that is the improvement of the Spirit in obedience to God. And it is only something that is exhibited because of the reception of saving grace. And as I said, if you're doing good works, it may be a sign of sanctification, and you really are doing these things out of absolute selflessness. But then again, it's just as, and perhaps more likely, that somebody performing good works is simply doing it because they're trying to earn their way into heaven. Okay, and so this brings up a lot of questions. Again, how am I to know if I'm saved? How are we to know if anybody is saved? So, okay, this is what William Perkins wrestled with. This was an English Puritan theologian, and based on his own study and his own observations, he came up with this idea that conversion, that is to say, the becoming one of the elect, happens according to a process that takes 10 steps. Okay, and the first step one takes, of course, is attendance to the Word of God. That is to say, obviously, exposure to the Bible, reading the Bible or having it read to you, attending church, listening to sermons, where where you're exposed to the Word, and then you get to the second stage, which is knowledge of the law. That is the law of Moses. Okay, the 10 Commandments. Once you know this, once you grip this, you will then reach stage 3, which is an awareness of your own sinfulness. And it starts with original sin. You become aware of that, and then you understand that original sin is more than enough to damn you. Then you'll start to think about, well, there's original sin, and then there's the other stuff I've done, right? The stuff maybe other people are aware of, but also the stuff that only you are aware of and you don't, and you hold within yourself. That should bring on stage 4, which is conviction of sin, and that is the knowledge, the understanding that what you have done absolutely is enough to condemn you in God's eyes, which brings on what they call legal fear, right? That's that adrenaline rush of terror, of realizing, oh my God, it's not just that I, took this advantage, or I was unkind to somebody here and there, or I was selfish, or I was gluttonous, or I was pervert. Oh my gosh, all the things I've done. And I have this in red because, according to Perkins, this is something this is something of a permanent stage. But it also indicates this is the first major obstacle to election. Because what's going to happen? You hear the word, okay, I get it. You understand the law of Moses. Yeah, I get that. And I understand my sins, right? And then, at this point, most people are going to just know that based on original sin plus their own sinfulness, that they are just going to come to the belief that there is no possible way that they are among the elect. Now, you can't really know whether you are or are not among the elect, but legal fear can be so great that you never get over it, and then therefore never progress. But if you can manage to overcome your legal fear, you're never going to get rid of it. But if you can move past it, you can understand the consideration of the promise of salvation, right? So this gets into this business of justification, the imputation of Christ's righteousness to sinners, that it can happen and that you might be worthy of this consideration. And once you understand and begin to believe this, that certainly brings you to this next stage 6, a will and desire to believe in the promise of salvation. Right now, we have to be very, very careful. Will, desire, belief, these are technically efforts, right? This is technically effort. And if you're a Calvinist, you cannot get to heaven. You cannot earn salvation through any effort on your own. So all of this has to be on the understanding that none of this is affecting your salvation, right? You're either going to have it or you are not. But Perkins believed that you still move through this process. So if you develop this and cultivate this will and desire to believe in the promise of salvation, you start to feel a little better. You start to feel, I wouldn't know if I'd say anything about confidence, but you do start to, this legal fear begins to diminish. But then you get this, and then you come to the next point that catches a lot of people who make it this far, and that is soul combat with despair. So it's, oh my God, there's all the things I've done in my life that were, but I do understand that I could be saved, and I really do want that, but I don't deserve it. I really don't. I am absolutely unworthy. And that brings on despair. Oh my God, I really am going to hell. And that's upsetting, right? This is the next point that snags the people who made it past legal fear. Most of the people who get to this point are not going to get past that despair. They will actually become more and more convicted of their damnation than hopeful of the possibility of their salvation. Now, again, the despair never goes away. If you make it past this, if you can manage to conquer your despair, again, this isn't an effort to earn salvation, but you can get to an assurance, a persuasion of the existence of God's infinite mercy, that it doesn't necessarily matter what you've done in your life, or what you are doing now, or what you're going to do that has anything to do with your salvation. So you might make it past here to get to this, but this is never going to totally go away. This will come back from time to time. This is always sort of there, right? And so these two go together. But if you can get to an assurance of God's mercy, and I'm not saying that means that you are assured of your salvation. It just means you understand and you trust that God's infinite mercy may come to you. You'll start to feel a little better, and then you will experience what they call evangelical sorrow, and that is a genuine remorse for all of the sins that you've committed. Beyond, of course, original sin is not a sin you've committed. It's a sin that's been that's imputed to you by virtue of your birth. But everything else you've done since the age of 7, right? 7 is the age of reason. They give you a pass for all the stuff you did when you were a little kid. But once you're 7 years old, you are now absolutely morally responsible for everything you do. You think about that, and you feel and you understand. They talk about every sin you commit is as though you are whipping Jesus. You're scourging Jesus before each one of your sins is, one of those balls at the end of a cat of 9 tails that they would beat Jesus with, right? You would feel terrible about this, and that's evangelical sorrow. Again, something that never entirely goes away. But if you can avoid getting caught too much up in despair and sorrow, then you may be regenerate. You may be a recipient of grace. So, again, we get to, theoretically a large number of people up here, but through these filters of legal fear, despair, evangelical sorrow, the numbers of people who are going to genuinely be in grace is going to be comparatively very small. So Calvinism is an austere, it's a harsh theology. Now, this brings us to consideration of critics of the way New England is organized. And what I want to do, we were talking before about how the Catholic Church reacted to its critics. And now that we have Puritan government in New England, 2 colonies, Massachusetts and Plymouth, let's take a couple of examples of how critics to Massachusetts in particular were dealt with. The first of these is a man named Roger Williams, who was an early immigrant to Massachusetts Bay and became a teacher in the Boston church, but he had said, I can't because I am a separatist. He is a follower of Robert Brown. So, he looked at Massachusetts, he looked at Boston and said, I don't like this relationship between the civil government and the church, because what developed very early, and I'll talk about this in more detail later, essentially the way it worked was that if you were a member of a church, you had the right to vote, and if you were not a member of the church, that is to say a Congregationalist church, then you are not allowed the right to vote. And Williams was not happy about that. That's too cozy a relationship between church and state, and so he moved to Plymouth. And when he lived in Plymouth, he said these guys aren't really all that separatist either. They're not. The strictness of their separatist theology wasn't too good. So then he moves one more time to Salem. As you know, Salem is by this point a small settlement on the coast of Massachusetts Bay, just north of Boston, and assists its Reverend Samuel Skelton. And as he's living more time in Massachusetts, he starts to become even more concerned about two things: the mix of politics and religion, and the government's treatment of their Indian neighbors. And so he becomes critical of this and starts to write treatises about this. And not surprisingly, he is reprimanded for it. As you know, the Catholic Church, with Martin Luther and these others, would politely invite them to shut up for their own safety. John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts, is actually quite friendly to Roger Williams. He tells him, hey, listen, I think I consider you a friend, and I'm telling you, for your own sake, you need to shut up your criticism. Because it's going to get you into trouble. But he would not shut up. He maintained his opinions. And so in 1635, he was charged with sedition and heresy, because by this point, he has accused Massachusetts Bay of being a theocracy. And he condemns Massachusetts Bay for its treatment of its Indian neighbors, which isn't great. So this begs the question, for instance, is Massachusetts Bay actually a theocracy? Well, what is a theocracy? A theocracy is where the religious leadership also constitute the political leadership. Massachusetts Bay forbade its clergy from holding any civil office, including that of the governor. So, technically, Massachusetts Bay is not a theocracy. But, already by this point, the only way one can become a governor of Massachusetts Bay, the only way one can become a mayor of a town or an alderman or any kind of magistrate is church membership, which does mean that political power still runs through religious power. So functionally theocratic, but not technically theocratic. Doesn't matter to Williams, and this is what's going to get him into trouble. And so he is charged and convicted of heresy and sedition, and the punishment is banishment. And so he moves south beyond Plymouth to the Narragansett Bay region in 1636 and purchases land from the Narragansetts to establish the settlement of Providence, which is going to be the beginnings of Rhode Island. So here is a map showing, again, to sort of show us where things are. Here's Plymouth, the first settlement in this area in 1620. A little bit later than that, you have Salem, established in 1626, and Boston very shortly after in 1630. Here is Providence down here in 1636. By this time already, of course, a number of people have migrated westward toward the Connecticut River and down into this area to establish the formal colony of Connecticut by about the same time, 1636. So we have basically 4 colonies that are going to be incorporated very shortly by the late 1630s: Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And then much later on, you're going to have New Hampshire. People are living up here, but New Hampshire is not going to be incorporated for some time yet. All right, our next challenge to church authority and governmental authority is going to be presented by Mistress Anne Hutchinson. And she is another early immigrant to Massachusetts Bay. Her pastor back home in England, a guy named John Cotton, has declared his intention to immigrate to Massachusetts Bay, and she convinces her husband that they are to follow him. And so the entire Hutchinson family picks up stakes and follows Reverend Cotton to Massachusetts in 1634. In fact, he's her husband's a fairly prosperous merchant, and they build a house that is literally a little bit down the road and across the street from Governor Winthrop's house. And so they become neighbors and get to know each other. And what is interesting here, of course, is that Mistress Hutchinson is an extremely devout Puritan. She is, she has the ability to read. She reads the Bible almost obsessively, as well as the various theological treatises written by a number of Puritan theologians. And of course, Calvin's works are her real touchstone. And as she lives in Massachusetts and begins attending the churches, she becomes convinced that too many of the colony's ministers have lapsed into a heresy known as Arminianism. And that is to say that when you're preaching Calvinism, you may have noticed that we talk about, will to believe, the hoping, thinking, performing good works, and things like that. If you are preaching correctly, according to her, you're making it abundantly clear that these things are the signs of righteousness, but they are not the means to salvation in any way, shape, or form. But clergymen keep saying, well, you are supposed to do these things. And so she says that they slip into saying, as the Anglican Church says, even the Catholic Church says, good works lead to faith, and good works can lead to salvation. Right? So Arminianism is known as the covenant of works, but pure Calvinist Puritan theology argues that there is only the covenant of grace, and that good works are merely the product of grace. They are not the means to it. And so she says that most of the clergy are preaching the covenant of works. Now, and she says this at informal meetings held at her house on days when there are church services. This is not at all unusual. In fact, it is encouraged. If you were a Puritan New Englander, for instance, and you go to church, you're encouraged to bring your Bible with you. The minister will give a very tightly and carefully constructed sermon with an argument and a point, and will cite scripture to explain where he is getting his ideas from and what you need to conclude from that. And you're expected to have your Bible right there and follow along and make notes and talk about it. And so having meetings is not unusual. And Hutchinson participating in these meetings is not in itself unusual. The problem develops when she begins to assert a leadership position. Technically, in her house, she should be subject to her husband's authority. Okay? And that she should be, a participant, but that her husband should lead the meeting. But her husband doesn't do this. And there's lots of questions about that. Well, why is this? Why did he not intervene? And historians are divided on whether maybe she was just so powerful of personality that she literally, you know, just dominated her husband, who just kept his mouth shut. But then I like the idea that he just simply supported her, that he saw that she was had a brilliant mind, and that, and why shouldn't she be able to express her thoughts and opinions? That's what I like to think. There seems to be abundant evidence that that's exactly what happened, I think. So she expounds on theology and begins to be critical of most of the ministry of the colony. And again, Governor Winthrop comes by and says, "Oh, Mr. Hutchinson, I don't have a problem with you being at these meetings, and certainly you can voice certain opinions, but keep it to theology and don't assert leadership." Some of the people, men and women in a growing group of people who are coming to your house, are starting to talk about you and treat you like you're a minister, and you're not doing that, are you? And she said, "No, of course I'm not." He said, "Okay, fine. Just don't criticize the clergy. Certainly don't criticize our government. Otherwise, it's fine." And she says, "I'm not doing anything that crosses any lines." Okay, well, she keeps up her criticism of the clergy and decides that literally, apart from her minister, John Cotton, and her brother-in-law, John Wheelwright, that the rest of the clergy are preaching bad theology. So then she is visited again by a group of clergymen and Governor Winthrop, and they warn her that if she does not remain quiet, there's going to be a lot of trouble. So, all right. In the midst of this beginnings of a problem, it's important that we understand something about these early North American communities, and that is that, of course, especially in New England, they are going to be very small and very tightly knit. Everybody lives near each other. Everybody knows each other. And the women, are, of course, they're expected at some point early in their lives, in their 20s, to get married and start having babies. And in order to have babies, you have to have a midwife. There are no obstetricians. There are male physicians, but childbirth was not considered anything that a physician should be involved in. Childbirth was exclusively a female activity. So when someone's pregnant wife goes into labor, she will take to her bed in the bedroom. The women of the community will converge on the house, and many of them will spend their time in the room with her. The men will not intrude. The men will keep themselves to some other part of the house or outside the house, while the women tend to the woman in labor. And of course, the midwife is going to be a woman who has already experienced childbirth and has helped birth children herself. And Anne, being an experienced mother and midwife, is performing this service for one of her neighbors and followers, a woman by the name of Mary Dyer. And the tragic outcome is of a stillborn child that was afflicted with extreme microcephaly, according to John Cotton's private account of what happened. Essentially, the child was born without a cranium. It just had a face, but it didn't have anything more of the head. And so, considering the trouble that Anne and now her followers are starting to get into for their critiques of church and now beginning to become political critiques, John Cotton, who was present at the house but not in the room until later, advises that the child be buried, and just, okay, put it out there that the child died. Don't let anybody see it. Don't let anyone see the body, because this is an event known as a monstrous birth. When a child is born, stillborn, or is born particularly with a deformity, it is referred to as a monstrous birth, and it's usually something that is, again, it has a scientific explanation, but it also has a spiritual component. And it is usually what they call a sign or an omen or a wonder. So, considering the situation, Cotton says, let's bury the child, let's grieve, but let's keep the details away from public view, because this is going to just make things look worse for you guys. So the Hutchinsonians go on, and they begin to attack the government. And specifically Governor Winthrop. Now, not Anne herself, just her followers. And they get the support of a rival to the governorship, and that is Sir Henry Vane, who in fact gets elected to the governorship of Massachusetts Bay in 1636. And so he is supportive of the Hutchinsonians, although he does suggest that they might want to tone down their rhetoric a little bit. But it ultimately is not going to go well for Anne, because so many men are deferring to her authority. Women are doing so as well. She continues to hold the meetings in her home and propagating her opinions, and this is going to just end up in a situation where they are going to be, check this. Okay, so she is eventually going to be put on trial for her heretical opinions, and she almost gets out of it, but ultimately they are able to convict her on 37 counts of heresy, and she and her family and many of her followers are banished from the colony, and they go to Rhode Island. And while there, she appears to be pregnant, but goes into premature labor. Mary Dyer, okay, the woman who suffered the monstrous birth, is Anne's midwife, and according to witnesses to this event, this monstrous birth, 37 lumps of flesh were expelled from her womb. So she was clearly not pregnant, but suffering from uterine cancer. And what is interesting is that there's been a change of administration. Vane is out, Winthrop is back in. He finds out about Mary Dyer's monstrous birth from before and orders an autopsy of the infant's corpse, and concludes, yes, this was a terrible tragedy for the Dyer family, but it was a warning from God that the Dyers should have reformed themselves and become more properly Orthodox Congregationalist New Englanders. Later, he learns about what happens with Mistress Hutchinson and noted, 37 lumps of flesh, 37 counts of heresy. God is trying to tell her something, that she needs to change her views and resume a proper submissive role to male authority. Now, given what's going on with regard to Hutchinson and Dyer and these monstrous births and the fact that they were midwives to each other when these things happen, leads to rumors about witchcraft, or at least occultism, being practiced by the Hutchinsonians. No one levies an actual accusation of witchcraft, but the rumors are kind of out there. While in Rhode Island, Dyer converts to Quakerism and returns to Massachusetts, where she gets into trouble with the government there. Hutchinson and her family eventually settle in western Long Island, not far from New York City. And in 1647, during Keith's War, the Seminole Indians raid the settlement where she lives and kill her and her family. Which Winthrop hears of, and Mark says, well, there you go, right? She ultimately reaped what she has sown. In the meantime, Mary Dyer returns to Massachusetts, and it is against the law to be a Quaker in Massachusetts. If you are discovered, the first offense is banishment. The second offense is to have your tongue run through with a red-hot needle as punishment for speaking out. Because, what's going to get you outed as a Quaker? Quakers are very obliging on this point. They are extremely critical of Congregationalism and Calvinism, and demonstrate against what they, again, like Roger Williams did, against what they perceive as theocracy in Massachusetts. And so Quakers are not hard to discover. However, if you are caught on a third offense, you are hanged. And this, unfortunately, is what happened with Mary Dyer. She is hanged along with three other convicted Quakers in May of 1660. Okay. Now, going back to the late 1630s and early 1640s, it is believed that something has to be done in Massachusetts and Connecticut to bring those colonies' churches more into line with proper doctrine and practice, because the very fact of the matter is that Congregationalism is not the only game in town. There are people who are Anglicans living in the colonies. They don't have any churches to practice in, but they are still Anglicans. You have Quakers, obviously, and they're practicing secretly in one another's homes. There are other groups out there that have a variety of unusual or downright bizarre theologies and practices. I don't want to get too much into that, but let's just suffice it to say that there is more religious pluralism in New England than it would at first appear to be. But even within Congregationalism, there are minor variations in terms of theology, doctrine, and practice, and there is a concern on the part of the government in both colonies that that if these differences and variations are allowed to continue, that those differences will grow and result in still more religious pluralism, which they definitely do not want. Okay, so let's turn our attention to Indian relations a little bit. I was talking about I was showing you that map with the geography of disposition of Indian nations within what becomes New England. And to make a somewhat complicated story simple, the English presume their racial and cultural superiority over the Indians. They don't believe the Indians are worthy of the land they're on because they don't sufficiently, quote unquote, improve it. They interpret Indian assertions of sovereignty and pushback against colonialism as naked barbarism and savagery, to say nothing of insubordination, and they therefore have more conflict than there's more conflict than there is diplomacy. And as I said, this is what Roger Williams complained about, and perhaps the worst incident in this early history of Puritan Indian relations was the Pequot War in 1634. What you had was the Pequot Nation was one of the more powerful nations in southern New England, But the Pequots essentially were impeding the establishment of Connecticut. And so, again, long story short, the Connecticut and Massachusetts governments convince a group of Indian nations, specifically the Wampanoags, the Narragansetts, the Nipmucks, to join them in a war of extermination against the Pequots, which they very nearly completed. The worst incident being the sacking of a village on the Mystic River, wherein Captain John Underhill and his militia and Indian allies completely surrounded the village, trapped everyone in their homes, and set fire to their houses. And again, they nearly succeeded in completely eradicating the Pequot nation from New England. The tribes that allied with the New Englanders in this thought they were going to get direct benefits from their participation in terms of favorable trade, military protection from the Iroquois, and all of that. And again, almost nothing of that materialized. And that's going to bear some fruit later in the century. But technically, in every European colonial venture in America, the number one reason for doing it on paper was to convert the Indians to Christianity. But in practice, that's certainly not very important. The Spanish were diligent about doing this, but they went about conversion with fire and sword. The French up in Canada were much more subtle and respectful and careful in their approach, and their progress was very slow, but it was but it was steadier. The English have very little interest in converting the Indians to Christianity, whatever their charters claimed otherwise. But there are a few who took this idea seriously, and John Eliot is prime among these. And he is another early immigrant to Massachusetts in 1631. He was a member of the clerical body that tried Anne Hutchinson in 1637. He was a co-author of the Bay Psalm book, and he was determined to try to convert the Indians to Christianity because that would end the conflicts, right? That would solve the problem of dealing with them as adversaries. And so the Massachusetts General Court passes the Act of for the Propagation of the Gospel among the Indians in 1646, and a grant from the government as well as fundraisers generated £12,000 to begin to build schools for Indians to learn English and Christianity. But Indian interest was tepid at best. For the most part, Indians who expressed interest in Christianity did so more for political and commercial reasons than anything else. Now, to be fair, they are living through what appears to be an apocalyptic event. Disease epidemics, periodically come through and are wiping out 1/3 to 1/2 of a village's population. And some Indians, in desperation, do turn to Christianity, thinking that maybe conversion to Christianity will stop the epidemics. But most of the Indians who convert to Christianity are doing so purely for looking for diplomatic and economic advantage. But even so, very few are really seriously interested in doing this in any way, shape, or form. And so these schools don't do too well. But to his credit, John Eliot does something that the vast majority of English missionaries, however few they are, refuse to do. He actually tries to learn native languages. And in November 1646, he delivered his first sermon in Massachusetts and translated the Bible into that language in 1663. Okay, so that's a little bit after, but so here's by the way, Obviously, these are the Massachusetts are not people who have a written language. So basically, what this is just using the Latin alphabet to create a phonetic approximation of Massachusetts. So as you see, there are native words here, but then, of course, there are words that don't translate into Massachusetts. So you still see, Testament and print, things like that. But one of the things that sort of moves Eliot's endeavor forward in 1646 is the conversion of the Nipmuc Sachem Waban, which then leads to the establishment of a plan for schools in segregated Christian Indian villages, which are going to eventually be known as praying towns. Because what Eliot realized is that in his early experience he would convert Indians to Christianity, some of them, but then living amongst their relations, their families, and their neighbors in Indian villages would very quickly fall out of any kind of Christian belief and practice. They would slip back into their old belief systems. So he believes that the only thing that can be a corrective to that is that any Indian that converts to Christianity has to live among other Christian Indians away from their pagan friends, neighbors, and loved ones. And so he talks about we're going to establish segregated special towns populated only by these praying Indians. Okay. And the children of these Indians will be indentured servants in the homes of white people. And altogether, this will, along with the schools and the churches, are going to lead to the Christianization of New England's tribal peoples. But among the other rules is not just that you have to be Christian and all that stuff. You have to, in living in a praying town, you have to dress and behave yourself in an English fashion. You can only speak English and practice farming and other trades in the way English do and not the way Indians do. Your job is to improve any unimproved lands in the way that the English do it. That is, clear the trees, rip out the stumps, till the soil the way the English do, not the way you used to do it. But of course, what's important to remember is that in these Eastern woodland societies, all agriculture is practiced by women. The responsibility of the men is to hunt and to fight. Indian agriculture, if you were to see it practiced, if you were able to go back to that time period and watch Indians do it, you would look at it and say, this doesn't look anything like farming as I understand it. This looks like gardening. The women enjoy the work. It's a communal activity, and they get perfectly good yields through what is called mixed cultivation. But that's not how the English do it. The English have inherited from Europe this idea that this field is for rye, and this field is for wheat, and this field is for potatoes, and you separate everything out. And men do the farming. So you're asking Indians to essentially reverse their gender roles to some extent, especially the men. And that's very difficult to make stick. Okay? And, of course, restrictions on you can't go see your friends and family anymore who are not praying Indians themselves. Rules about no alcohol consumption and all these other things. It's too much for most of the Indians to abide by. And so absenteeism and backsliding and downright abandonment of the praying towns is a common problem that Eliot and his supporters have to contend with. Now, here's a map showing the locations of these praying towns. And what I want to draw your attention to is over here is Boston, and over here is the praying town of Natick. Now, what would happen in the event that you have a praying town that's located close to an English town, okay, and to be, I guess to be fair to Eliot and all that stuff, it seems that he wants to try to locate them away from English settlements, but especially with regard to Boston and Worcester, what happens is you will have large swaths of land out here that is under English-style Indian cultivation, and then you've got large swaths of land out here belonging to English colonists. And what happens is that, of course, the Indians are expected to improve unimproved land, and that is to say, wooded, densely forested land, because this is the eastern woodlands of east of the Mississippi River at this time was so densely forested, and of course you can't, the Indian, a traditional Indian village, they don't have to clear a lot of land to set up their garden plots to produce enough food to sustain themselves. But to practice agriculture in a Euro-American fashion, you need a lot of land to produce that much food. So there's a lot of pressure to cut down trees and clear lands. And what would happen is if you have a praying Indian who either owns or more often is leasing chunks of land that he is busy improving and clearing, if that land borders on land that is owned by an English settler, a disturbing pattern arose in which once the Indian has cleared the land and begun to cultivate it, and usually after he has gathered his first harvest, when he goes back out later in the late winter, early spring to begin plowing and setting things up in order to put a new crop in, he will notice that a big chunk of his land has been fenced in by his English neighbor. And a property dispute develops, and so the Indian is going to know how New Englanders settle property disputes, and they do it by going to court. So what's going to happen is that the praying Indian is going to sue his neighbor for violating property boundaries, but you can guess what's going to happen when they bring this case to a white, colonist judge. He's going to side with the English colonist in almost every case. And so what starts to become a common belief among the praying Indians is that the praying towns are nothing more than a way to get Indians to just simply do the hard work of clearing land, and then the English colonists just move in on that land and take it over and shove the Indians out. And that it isn't really about Christianizing Indians in any way, shape, or form. Now, this is not entirely the truth, but perception perception is reality. And so native resentment against the English settlers is going to be steadily increasing. So little surprise to learn that no particular praying town had more than 150 residents at any one time, and most of them had far fewer than that. Government support for the praying towns begins to dwindle. The ordinary English colonists don't trust Indians in any case, and they believe that praying Indians are even least trustworthy, that they are, probably spies and that they're faking it, and maybe some of them were, but most of them, I think, were quite sincere in trying to be Christian people, but they ran into the barrier of English prejudice everywhere they went. And so this leads to a general rejection of Christianity by a lot of the native peoples. Most of the people living in the praying towns ultimately end up back in their former communities and practicing their traditional religions. And so by 1674, the entire network, the enterprise of this has been abandoned. But what happens though is you've suddenly got these nice little places that are all set up and lands are cleared and ready for cultivation, and those lands end up going at pretty good rates to new colonists. So again, it leads to that perception that the praying towns was just a ruse to get Indians to clear land for the English colonists. So this is going to sow deep seeds for future conflict that we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, let me go back to, I was telling you, in the wake of the Hutchinson controversy, this Antinomian controversy, there was a general concern among the clergy that there was too much religious pluralism. There was too much diversity and variation of Christian practice in New England, and that something needs to be done about this. And so what happens in 1648 is that it starts in 1645 and lasts for 3 years, but what's going to develop is something known as the Cambridge Platform. And it's going to be an attempt to sort of regularize church practice in New England's Congregationalist churches. So one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to establish a specific process by which one acquires membership in a congregational church. Up to this point, it was something that was between the applicant and the minister, and it could go in any number of ways depending on the disposition of the minister. But what the Cambridge Platform says is no, there needs to be a specific process. And it starts with, obviously, the applicant has to believe that he or she has experienced a true conversion. And if they believe that they've experienced a conversion, they then should speak with the church elders and the minister to determine if it is a valid conversion experience, and the minister gets the final say on whether he thinks that this is valid. If he believes that it is a genuine conversion experience, the applicant will then meet with a panel of some of his or her minister's colleagues, and he or she will be examined to, okay, what do you know of theology? What do you know? Tell us your story about your conversion. Do you know your Bible? Right? And this, if it leads to a thumbs up, the applicant has to deliver what is known as a profession of faith and has to deliver it in a written form to the minister and has to recite it in church before the entire congregation. Okay? And the written form of this needs to be just a simple narrative. Here's what happened to me that made me believe that maybe I'm among the elect. And you have to, in this, demonstrate that you know the Bible. So certain incidents in your life might be analogous to stories in the Bible. So you would throw in a parenthetical reference to a bit of scripture that so it illustrates various points. And these things prove that you know your Bible reasonably well. And you recite this and confess your sins before the congregation, after which the male membership goes away to deliberate and render a vote on whether to admit the applicant to membership. And if obviously if it's an affirmative vote, then all is well. You are granted church membership. And if you are a male applicant, then that membership means that you will have the right to hold civil office and get to vote. Of course, clergymen are accepted. Clergymen can vote, obviously, in elections, but they cannot hold civil office. So that's what I mean about it might be functionally theocratic, but it is not technically theocratic. There are women who are members of churches. They don't get to vote. However, if there is a deadlock between the male members, the female members might have their opinion canvassed, and if there is a large majority of the women voting in the affirmative, then usually the minister will persuade somebody among the male members to change his vote so that it will be an affirmative for membership. Now, what if the vote goes against the applicant? What happens then? Well, okay, that's not necessarily a disaster. It doesn't mean that you've failed and you're never going to get to be a member of the church. It just means that maybe what happened to you, according to them, is not that you had a genuine conversion experience, but rather what happened was that you had something that was more preparatory to true conversion that will happen later. But what this shows, that this is congregationalism. You'll notice that the church elders and the church membership hold every bit as much authority and power as does the minister. In fact, the elders of the church are the ones who hire and fire ministers. They're the ones who are responsible for paying him his salary. And so the minister has to be a good one, right? In order to please the elders, please the membership, and continue in his job. So this is what I mean by congregationalism. So if I'm a minister of a church, I certainly have influence, and my opinion is highly valued. But if I'm at odds with the membership and with the elders especially, then my ability to move opinion is going to be minimal at best. So again, this is a legacy of the Radical Reformation that was extremely itchy about church authority figures having a great deal of power and influence. As I said, being a minister still comes with a certain degree of respectability, obviously, and certain community authority and a certain gravitas. But if that aura of authority does not jibe with your actions as minister or with your theology, then you could get into trouble and find yourself out of a job. So let's have a summary of New England culture as we understand it. And as you no doubt have realized, the meeting house is the center of the community, sometimes the physical center of the community. It's where everyone meets. It's where everybody knows each other, right? And as you, again, are not going to be surprised to learn, these being relatively small communities, there's a lot of intermarriage, and so there's lots of kinship networks going on in these towns, and a great deal of importance placed on the extended family, right? And this is because of longevity, because by the middle of the 17th century, the average lifespan of a New Englander is approximately 3 to 4 years greater than their counterparts in Old England. So men and women are living longer. And so in many cases, you might have 3 generations of people living in the same house. And through marriage and various things, you develop these kinship networks that operate in these towns. And anybody who's ever grown up or lived in a small town, even today, knows that this is a thing, right? And that there are certain families are prominent and wealthy and tend to run everything, and they are linked up with other wealthy and influential families, and then there's everybody else who just kind of knows. Everybody just kind of, these 2 families or these 3 families or whatever, 4 families, whatever, are the ones everybody knows by reputation, and to some extent they control maybe the political life, the spiritual life of the town and whatnot. And this is no less true of New England. Marriage patterns. Okay, so here's something we can dispense with right away, is that there's a misconception that people in early America got married as teenagers, and that is absolutely not true. Most men did not marry until they were 25, and women until they're 23. Now, the reason is not necessarily because they are absolutely opposed to teenagers getting married, but again, I told you before, 7 is the age of reason, but they also believed that 16 is when you become an adult, for definitely, but they seem to say that, well, technically you might be legally adult by 16, but you're really not at a point where you can be independent and absolutely responsible for yourself and rely and be able to be self-reliant until you're at least 20 years old. Okay, whether you're a man or a woman, but especially if you're a man. But because people are living longer, okay, back home in Europe, when you got to be about 22, 23, that's about the point when your parents might, will start to die, right? And then you would inherit their land or inherit the business or whatever it is you're doing. That's not happening so much in New England anymore. People are living into their 60s. And if you are, if you get married, if you're the child of parents who married in their late teens or early, or very early 20s, you might not be able to take possession of your inheritance until you're far into adulthood. And it's impossible to be independent. And what this does is it forces men to have to seek their fortunes away from the family business, or find land to cultivate that is not necessarily their father's land. And this is going to create a situation where land ownership patterns are going to be such that that land is at such a premium that there's an enormous amount of pressure to move outwards. So this is going to, again, complicate Indian relationships. It's going to create conflict within and among communities over ownership of land and that sort of thing. But probably the worst pressure that any New Englanders experienced were women. Obviously, women were expected to get married and have children, right? And so women are getting married in their early 20s, but if you get to be past 25 and you're not married, then there's lots of, well, what's going on with that? Why is that happening? Is it, there certainly... people would like to marry people that they find aesthetically pleasing, but that's not a luxury that you can have in these small communities with relatively low populations. And finding eligible people to marry, you can't worry too much about what somebody looks like, right? And so it's not a question of that. Is it a question of personality? Well, that can't be a factor either necessarily. And so there's lots of rumors and speculation about why a woman in her late 20s or early 30s may never have gotten married. Did she consciously choose not to get married? And if so, why? Another problem, of course, is that, when we're talking about longevity, the same is true today as was then, and that is that women tended to outlive men. Men tended to die earlier. And mortality rates for men were such that it wasn't unusual for a woman to be married for 20 or 30 years, and then her husband dies, and then she would be expected to get remarried. Unless she was very old, obviously, unless she was already in her, late 50s or 60s or whatever, maybe not. But if she's in her 20s or 30s, absolutely would she be expected to get remarried. And if she did not do this, again, why not? But if you were a woman alone, as it were, if you were married and your husband suddenly died, you are exposed in a certain degree because you are you're technically no longer under your father's authority or another male relative's authority, and you're exposed to legal jeopardy if there is a property dispute or if there's some kind of other argument over money or whatever. But if you get remarried in the middle of some legal trouble that you're in, if you get remarried, then that legal trouble becomes your new husband's problem and not yours anymore. And so a lot of women who found themselves widowed whether they liked it or not, or whether they wanted to or not, would have to get remarried just to make sure that they were legally covered, especially in situations where there is a lot of property or where there's a lot of wealth involved. But if women did not remarry, or if women never got married at all, lots of rumors and speculation and concerns swirl around that, and that gets us into things to do with the prevalence of gossip, which I'll get into in a moment. But as far as land ownership patterns, like I said, most people in New England is not an extremely fertile region. The topsoil is very thin. The ground underneath that is rocky. The growing season is very short. You need a lot of acreage to produce very much food. And the way land ownership organized itself, it's not like what you find in the southern colonies where you have these enormous plantations and larger commercial farms and tenant farms. Most of the holdings rarely exceed 500 or 600 acres for most families that own land at all. Most people are tenant farmers, right? Okay, they don't own the land; they're renting it from somebody else. But what happens is, if let's be generous and say that you and your family own 1,000 acres of land, but then when the husband, when the man of the patriarch, when the man dies, the eldest son doesn't get all of the land. That's called primogeniture, and the Puritans did not practice that. In fact, a lot of that was had begun to fall out of favor even in England, but especially this was not practiced in New England. So what happens is that in your will you would dole out chunks. So you might give 1/3 of your acreage. So you'll give 333 acres to your eldest son. The law automatically would award to a widow 1/3. So 333 acres might go to your widow, and then the remaining 333 acres would then be distributed to your other children, however many they might be. And so, as I was saying, it takes a lot of acreage to support a family of 3 or 4. So if you are the eldest son inheriting approximately 340 or 350 acres, you might be okay. You might be all right, but your fortunes will have diminished relative to your father, who owned 1,000 acres. It's even worse if you're one of the younger children who's only getting a portion of the last third of that land. And you're not going to get enough land to do anything with. So you'll probably have to sell it out to your older brother, and then go see if you can buy land somewhere where it's cheaper and you can get more of the land that you need. And so, like I said, there's a lot of demand for arable land. There's a lot of outward pressure that's going to lead to a lot of conflict between colonists and Indians. But as I was talking about, these communities tend to be very small. Boston is the great metropolis with initially 1,000 or 2 people. That will grow fairly quickly over the course of the 17th century, but most people are going to be living in these small communities where everybody knows everybody else, everybody knows everybody's business, and information is in the form of hearsay. It's all gossip. There's no newspapers. There are no print. There are books around, but literacy rates don't exceed the amazingly high number of 65% of the population. But in the 17th century, books are expensive and not very plentiful, so most people get their information about what's going on in the world, and especially in their communities, through talking to their neighbors, and you know how that goes. People would find living in these close communities obviously stifling, but there's a degree to which, if you think about it now, of course, nobody would tolerate, the degree of which gossip and rumor and hearsay, and all of that stuff in a community today. But back then, think about the degree to which everybody knows everybody's business, everybody's neighbors, everybody knows where everybody is. if you live in a wilderness environment that is extremely thinly populated, and there are there are Indians on the frontier who may or may not be hostile to you. There's of course always, just several hundred miles to the north, there's the existence of the French, the Catholic French in New France, which is unnerving. Certainly the possibility of even worse things going on. The fact that your neighbors know your every movement for the most part can be a comfort. If you are, about going about your business and you're used to seeing your neighbor in his pasture mowing or doing whatever at the same time every weekday, and one day you go out there and they're not there, you may very well, something's wrong, and you're going to go and, knock on the door and find out if they're all right. And what if something is very badly wrong? What if you're sick? What if you're injured? It's not going to remain a secret. But again, like I said, downside of it is nothing can be a secret, right? And so, something that goes on, it's not outside the realm of possibility that other people will find out about it. And you can see why gossip and rumor is going to become a component of the Salem Witch Trials. So, I mentioned the astonishingly high literacy rates. One of the great legacies of the Protestant Reformation is an emphasis on early education so that people can read the Bible for themselves. And in the early 17th century, children learned to read. They learned their ABCs by learning a rhyming kind of sing-song thing that explained all of the letters. And these are 2 pages from the New England Primer. This is from the 1690 edition. And it starts with the letter A. In Adam's fall, we sinned all. So right there, original sin, right? Everything is part of a religious inculcation, right? Heaven to find, the Bible mind. So there's your B. C is for Christ. Christ crucified, for sinners died. Here's an interesting one. G. As runs the glass, our life doth pass. So there's a reminder about mortality, right? So there's lots of things, here to kind of remind us about, the presence of the supernatural and fear of the devil and all of that. Look at T. Young Timothy learned sin to fly, right? To get away. There's a nasty little devil creature he's running from. Here is X. Xerxes did die, and so must I. And then right after that, Y. While youth do cheer, death may be near. So there are frequent reminders of sudden mortality and mortality in general. One thing that the fact that yes, people died in larger numbers back then than they do now because they didn't have the medical technology or knowledge that we have today. And so you could go by the public cemetery on any given week and probably find a freshly dug and open grave waiting for a new occupant. And Puritan parents were keen to use these as teaching moments for children who are particularly disobedient and willful. A number of prominent clergymen and prominent New Englanders especially would talk about how when they were children they were probably rambunctious and disobedient, and that a parent would take them into the public graveyard and dangle them by their feet into the hole to remind them that basically. I could just drop you down in this hole and leave you here to spend the night to ponder your disobedience and your willfulness. Just as God holds all of us over the pit of hell, right? For our disobedience, and it's only His infinite mercy that keeps us from falling into the pit. Just as, it's like, I'm going to hold you over this hole. What's to stop me from dropping you in this hole and letting you spend the night here, kid? Oh, your love and justice and mercy, Father. That's right. So what are you going to do from now on, Junior? I'm going to obey you and do what you say. Okay, very good. Let's go on home. That's kind of the idea. There's lots of, reminders of mortality and reminders about original sin and all of that. So I was talking about population. So let's look at 17th century population figures. This is for all of the English colonies on the eastern seaboard. But of course, I want to focus here just on New England. And notice here, in 1630, this is at the point where Massachusetts Bay Colony has been founded, but Plymouth has already been in existence for 10 years. And you'll see that roughly, these are round numbers, and they've been rounded down a little bit for the sake of probably closer accuracy. Roughly 2,000 people are living in New England in 1630. But then by just 20 years later, that number has ballooned to 20,000 people, 1% of whom are African or African American, and the majority of them, of course, are enslaved. And then the population growth is fairly steady, following a doubling pattern that Benjamin Franklin comments on later in the 18th century. So by 1670, there's 50,000 people. By 1690, there are roughly 90,000 people living in New England, which is, by that point, we're talking about the colonies of Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and then New Hampshire. All right, so now let's go back to Old England and let's talk about what happened with the Civil War, the Cromwellian dictatorship, and the Stuart Restoration. So yes, there was a Puritan revolution in the 1640s and a consequent civil war that unseated King Charles I. The Puritans of Parliament basically took over the government of England. Oliver Cromwell was their leader. He oversees the military defeat of King Charles I's royalist forces. And he is apprehended, Charles I is, and executed as a traitor to the English people. And he establishes a government exclusively by Parliament, although it's essentially him as a dictator. But in New England, when word of this comes in 1640, by 1648, they're very excited. Maybe England has finally done what we were hoping that they were going to do, and institute a Puritan government. And so roughly about 1/3 of New England's population immigrates to England or back to England, presumably to live in a Puritan paradise. But that's not what they find. They find Cromwellian England to be astonishingly lax in Puritan theology and practice. Cromwell was a capable administrator, but his son was not. And when Cromwell died in 1658, his son wasn't able to keep things going. Certain royalist factions and others reached the ascendant, and so then Parliament votes to bring Charles I's son out of exile. He's in exile in France, and invite him to return and assume the throne as King Charles II. And this is 1660. This is called the Stuart Restoration. The Puritans who had come from New England to live in England were absolutely scandalized by this, and so as many as could flee back to New England to go back and live as they believe that Puritans are supposed to live. Okay? But going back to these population figures, when we're looking at the 1650s, 1670s, you see this very large population. Not all of them are Congregationalists. Not all of them are Calvinists. Not all of the Calvinists are Congregationalists. Some of them are Presbyterians. You've got Quakers. You've got people who are Anglicans, although there are still no Anglican churches yet. You've got other dissident sects and denominations, there. And what you have in the 1660s is a definite fear that the purity of the first generation, or the supposed theological and ideological purity of the first generation, is disappearing and is beginning to be replaced by a certain degree of religious and political diversity. And so this is one of the things that leads to a synod in 1662 in New England that results in a decision made about theology and doctrine that is known as the Halfway Covenant. And basically what we're talking about here is, as I said, we're now pretty far into the second generation of New England Congregationalists, New England Puritans. And what you have now is a strong concern about the nature of election. And the question basically is, does election run in families? Because what you start to have are a number of grandparents who worry about the status of their grandchildren in the event that their one or both of the parents of their grandchildren are not counted among the regenerate. So what is the status of a child of non-member parents, or whose parents are members? Or what if one parent is a member and another is not? Does God break up families? So the Synod of 1662 came up with this notion that election probably runs in families. I mean, let's be clear, though. I mean, if you're a hardcore Calvinist, if asked, does election run in families? The answer is no. If you die and go to heaven, is it possible that you might be the only member of your family to go to heaven? Absolutely. But this won't matter to you in heaven. You'll be with God, and the joy of that will just completely obliterate any of your earthly connections. Well, that's easy enough to say, but that's hard to embrace. And so what the Halfway Covenant basically says is that in the event that you have children in this condition, they can apply for provisional membership in a church on the assumption that they will eventually seek full membership later on. So this is called halfway membership. And being Congregationalist, being independent, each church is free to adopt these measures or not as they see fit. Approximately half of the churches do accept the Halfway Covenant, but that's important to understand. Half of them do not, and believe that this is too much of a compromise and too much of a violation of proper Calvinist theology. But there's another problem, another question that pertains to communion. Who gets to eat the bread and drink the wine at the end of the service? Most New England churches, Congregationalist churches, practice what is known as closed communion. That is to mean that if only church members, male and female, have access to the bread and the wine, period. It is the seal of conversion. But some churches practice what is known as mixed communion. Now, this is to say that the minister believes that not just church members should have the bread and wine, but also non-members who otherwise lead absolutely blameless lives, right? Who seem to be a very high moral and community reputation, right? So they're expected at some point, it's assumed, they will eventually become church members, most likely. That's called mixed communion. But a small minority of churches practice something called open communion, and that is because the minister in those churches believes that the bread and the wine can trigger a conversion experience, and therefore everybody in the church, regardless of whether they're members or not, regardless of reputation, have access to the bread and the wine. And this is a cause of tension and a cause of concern among those especially who are advocates of closed communion. So we have a second generation that's beginning to change. Being a Puritan in the 1660s is not the same as being a Puritan in the 1630s. Pure and simple. So I was talking about Indian relations, and I was talking about the frequent conflict and the constant intrusions upon Indian land and hostilities. And this is what brings Metacomet, the son of Massasoit, who is otherwise known as King Philip. The English call Metacomet King Philip because they didn't like saying Metacomet, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, he has had enough of these intrusions and these violations of treaties with the English, and he forges an alliance amongst his own Wampanoags, Nipmucs, and Narragansetts to wage war against the New Englanders and drive them out of their land once and for all. It's an attempted war of extermination. He tries to get other tribes to join him, but they won't do it, either because they feel they're too weak or they don't trust that Metacomet's forces can protect them if the English retaliate, or they are afraid of the disruption of trade. And what Metacomet hoped would be a large-scale war ended up breaking down to just a simmering frontier conflict, a series of raids mostly on frontier settlements throughout New England and along the Connecticut Valley. The tribes living on the periphery, many of them are allied to the French, take advantage of this to raid throughout Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York. And New England is slow to respond to this. But ultimately, the colonial militia began to start making some gains here and there. And by the summer of 1676, the militia have sufficiently organized in Connecticut and Massachusetts. They're coordinating with each other. They start taking out these war parties, and they've gradually isolated Metacomet and his army to a swampy area near what is now Bristol, Rhode Island. And in a final engagement there, Metacomet is shot in the back by a praying Indian, and Metacomet's head was severed along with his hands, and these are presented to the praying Indian as a reward, who then promptly sells them to the Plymouth government for 30 shillings. And the head and the hands are sent on a tour. Or I should say the head is actually put on a pike and stuck outside the walls of the gate of the Plymouth town. The hands are sent on a tour of Indian country as a grim reminder not to resist English authority. So this was seen as a sore trial, and a lot of New Englanders are beginning to believe that God is angry with them. And a lot of the first-generation Puritans are saying, well, yes, God is angry with us because we are beginning to compromise our theology. We're beginning to compromise our Christian practice. We're too tolerant of religious diversity. We're too tolerant of varying of Christian practice. And New England's problems get even worse when in 1685, King Charles I dies and is succeeded, King Charles II dies and is succeeded by his brother James II, and has begun to fundamentally reorder all of the governments of the northern colonies. Okay? Now, the thing about Charles II was, it's very likely Charles II was very soft on Catholics and was friendly with a lot of Catholics and eased up all sorts of restrictions on Catholics that were put in place by the English government. James II is an open Catholic. He converted in France. He is married to a French woman who is a devout Catholic, and he goes about privileging Catholics in England wherever he can at his court and in Parliament. And even though he's not going to overturn the English Reformation, but he is going to maintain the Church of England. And his reorganization of the northern colonies is in the form of something called the Dominion of New England. and he sends an aggressive Anglican military officer, Sir Edmund Andros, to govern it. All of the old colonial charters are abrogated. Andros is a brute, and he wields governmental authority like a club, and does so heavy-handedly that he even alienates some of his own co-religionists and people who otherwise would support him. Obviously, Calvinist New Englanders are extremely distressed by this, because it looks like what Andros is set to do is to destroy all forms of Christianity that are not Anglicanism. And it's fair to say that that is definitely what Andros wants to do. So, little surprise that in 1687, this goes back to the 1660s, but Michael Wigglesworth's epic poem about the Day of Doom gets a new printing in 1687 with a comment on the present troubles in New England, right? So, fortunately, I guess, for English Calvinists, and definitely for New England, is that James II was so heavy-handed and flagrant in his favoring of Catholicism that Parliament decides to overthrow him and invite his daughter Mary's husband to assume the throne as King William III. And he does so only if his wife can be a co-ruler. Parliament says fine. And so then William and Mary invade England in 1688, and quickly, with Parliament support, James II is not able to really mount a significant military challenge to his ouster, and ultimately is sent into exile. And this is known as the Glorious Revolution. So we now have a firmly Protestant, definitely Protestant government reestablished in England. And also, though, it also means the collapse, the dismantling of the Dominion of New England, and the people of Boston waste no time apprehending Sir Edmund Andros and sending him to England to stand trial for violating liberties, imposing the Anglican domination over dissenters, and a slew of other crimes, not to mention graft and exploitation. And what happens, though, is that in 1689, William and Mary pass two bills: the Bill of Rights, which is a step forward for the English libertarian tradition, but also the Act of Toleration. Now, if you recall, the people of Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut especially are not big on toleration of non-congregationalists, but the Act of Toleration says that if you are a Christian, you cannot be harassed for how you worship or for how you hold your theology. So, okay, that's not very popular in New England, but at least it's not the Dominion government. So what about the old colonial charters then? Massachusetts wants the old charter restored. And in the meantime, all the former Dominion colonies are brought under the direction of provisional governors, while new charters are drawn up. But what's very clear is that Massachusetts is not going to get a new charter, or not going to get a restoration of their old charter. They're going to get a new charter. And so what seems to be an initial victory starts to look like a certain degree of defeat, and then the Abenakis or Wabanakis to the north, with the French encouragement, are beginning to raid the New England frontier. They're burning out frontier settlements, and the refugees are streaming into neighboring Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New York. And many of them end up in Salem. Okay, so these are people who have lost their homes, people who have lost family members in these raids by the Wabanaki. And you're going to read about a lot of this in Mary Beth Norton's book, In the Devil's Snare. So during all this time, King Philip's War, the Dominion government, and now this uncertain period, you have the clergymen delivering blistering Jeremiad sermons blaming all of this on the sense of growing liberalism, uh, impiety, inattention to spiritual duty. There are rumors of diabolical influences at work at every level of Anglo-American and English society. The concern that Satan's minions, the Indians, they're raiding the frontier with almost with near impunity. There are rumors that the French are going to attack, and in fact, there is an Anglo-French war that breaks out in 1689, known as King William's War, which involves colonial militia fighting against the French and their Indian allies to the north. All of this looks like the city on a hill is in grave danger. And it's in this context that we start to see things happening in Salem Village, which is going to spark the conflagration that is the Salem Witch Trials. So I know a long lecture, but I needed to establish these things. Your books will talk about some of these things to a certain degree, but there's a certain presumption that you know all this stuff already before you read them. So I wanted to be able to give all of this to you and expand on some of this so that you would understand it a little bit better. So I appreciate your attention and your listening, and thank you, and I will talk to you later.